Hey folks, welcome to the Past Priority podcast, a podcast where we talk about competitive Commander from a different perspective. I'm your host, Greg, and today I'm joined by my lovely co-hosts, Evan and Dante.
Yo, what's up?
What's up, guys? I'm Evan, also known as zclan7 on Discord.
And hello, I am Dante, also known as Kodominuts on Discord. Or Twitter.
And I'm Greg. I think you guys know me at this point. So today, our podcast, we're going to be talking about interaction and how to understand priority, like when to use your counterspells, when to use your other pieces of interaction, and how not to get priority bullied. And we're going to start off by defining what we think interaction is. Because like the obvious definition is like a counterspell is a piece of interaction, or like an assassin's trophy or a chain of vapor is interaction. But it can get a little loose. I mean, you can really call a lot of things interaction. And so if you look at your deck and you're totaling up how many pieces of interaction you have, what are like the fringe things that also count for interaction?
I think that anything that can be defined as a disruption piece in any way, shape, or form for your opponents can be counted as interaction, which leaves the term so ridiculously broad that it's important to talk about how you can use each piece of interaction and what it means when you're deck building and also playing the game.
Right. I feel like you have to like delineate interaction. So there's like instant speed interaction, and then there's sorcery speed interaction, and then that's like the kind of disruption that we're looking at.
And then we can't get too loose with the definition too, because like technically Hallbreaker Horror is interaction, but most of the time you're just winning the game if it resolves. So
that is true.
It's pretty fun. So depending on what type of interaction you have, how should you position yourself at the table when like an Underworld Breach goes on the stack? Like obviously if an Underworld Breach resolves, that player is most likely winning the game. And so what should we do to make sure that we're not the ones, because you never want to be the one burning your resources to interact with the threat. And so what should like we do? How should we posture? What should we say to try to convince the table that we should be the last person to interact with it?
I think it's about positioning yourself as defining your. So first, you want to probably start off with defining what kind of deck you're playing. So let's just say the breach goes on the stack, but I'm in Sans Blue. Maybe I have the Beseiju, but you kind of want to. You want to always convey to the table that you don't have what they think or what they would want you to have. You want to always be in this kind of position where you're trying to convince everyone that you're not in a position to do what they want.
Yeah. And it also speaks to the importance of like face up and face down interaction. So, you, the Sans Blue player, has a Beseiju in hand, but the Thrasios player revealed a Swan Song off an activation 2 turns prior, right? So you should never speak about your Beseiju. You shouldn't even suggest that you have that card in your hand. It should always be pass priority to the guy who has revealed information. But then that should tell you a lot. It's like the breach player either like messed up, right? They didn't realize that the guy had a Swan Song, or they're also packing protection. And so you really learn a lot by revealed information.
I know this is further down in our talking points, but man, I am terrible at sandbagging.
Oh,
I get priority bullied hard because I'm always like, who has an interaction for this? Because I want to play my cards now, so I'm very guilty of that. So I will not take note of the Swan Song in hand. I have the Beseiju. I'm using the Beseiju.
Yeah, let's talk about that real quick. So, sandbagging interaction, not necessarily priority bowling, but sandbagging your interaction and what that actually means and looks like. All the time, I tell my table just complete lies about what I'm doing or what's in my hand, or I can't win the game yet, or I can't deal with this, when I clearly can, but I know if I have the opportunity to sandbag, you just convey that you have literally nothing until the time is right. So the example I'll give here is like Force of Will. They are gambling. They have like 8 cards in their hand, something stupid, and then they put. So I pass priority on gamble because I have a Force of Will I can counter whatever they gamble for. But then like they put breach on the stack, or Thassa's Oracle, or whatever it may be. If I know that there's one more point in the line later down that I have the chance to counterspell with a force of will, I will wait until that very last moment to counterspell with a force of will, because if I counterspell early, I didn't pass priority enough to the other players at the table to make them think that I have nothing and that they have to deal with it now,
Mhm.
right? But if I have that force of will at the very end, they'll be like, okay. So I just went all my interaction when I didn't have to.
Yeah.
And that's
Oh,
a
that's a
really
good
important
point.
thing to talk about. So, Greg, how do you feel about sandbagging interaction, and how do you think you should efficiently do it?
Uh, so the kind of the whole point about like face up face down interaction, if I have revealed interaction, I'm casting it as soon as I can, basically. The first threat that comes out, I'm interacting with it if it's revealed interaction. If I can sit on three pieces of interaction, three counterspells, or a combination of removal or whatever in my hand, and no one else knows about it, I'm not countering anything until like Thoracle trigger on the stack. Then I'll start to interact, because if I have a Rhystic Study or a Remora or something that benefits me off of my opponent's actions, right? There's no reason to try to stop them early on in the line. Like, I'll just get more resources if they burn through their cards. And if you have another player, if this is like a tournament setting, and you're 3 games in and they're kind of stressed out, they might recognize that, oh, this other player has nothing, they're just passing priority on all of this, right? Well, I have to interact now. And you can usually force other people to burn their cards before you if you just wait to the last possible moment. um, it's fun.
Yeah, I'll bring this up real quick. I was actually just played in Chaos. I forget what it is. I think it was Chaos 5. There was a game that there was a Sans Blue deck trying to do a breach line, but it was non-deterministic because they had to mill cards off the top, but they had to draw me cards into my Remora every single time to mill these cards. So I had the Besage in my hand from the very beginning, but I let them storm for like 5 or 6 card draw before I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to Besage this now before they get any more resources that I can't think about right now. But
Hmm.
because I sandbagged that interaction, I basically drew a new hand off of Mystic Remora and then proceeded to win on my next turn. Whereas
Mhm.
if I
Yeah.
just straight out showed them the Beseiju, got rid of their breach, then I'm not getting any more value, and I didn't really have anything else going on in my hand to close out that game. So it's
Yeah.
just a really good example of where you can just sandbag interaction because you know you can stop them later.
Hmm. And I should make a disclosure that, like, politics and like how you pose yourself at the table is really important, and it's not an easy skill to learn. Like, I will, my advice for new players who want to get really good at politicking and CDH is just take your hands off the table. Put your hands in your pocket, put your hands on your lap, or if you're playing over webcam, just put your hands on top of your head. Um, because if you're constantly touching your cards or touching your lands and pre-tapping things or just constantly looking at stuff, it's a huge signal to your opponents that this person has something they can do right now. And if you want to sandbag, you want to be that scummy person who's just passing priority on almost everything until it's almost too late. You just can't show any of these tells. And it gets really hard in an in-person setting if you're playing at a tournament, you're playing at your LGS. But just like try to be really cool about it, because otherwise you're going to be like fidgeting and it's like, oh, I passed priority on this spell and no one's going to believe you. And then they'll reset priority, it'll come back to you, and you'll be bullied into interacting.
It's interesting saying, the difference between webcam and in person, because I know when I play over webcam, I'm super guilty of like just always having like always just picking up my hand, like looking through my cards, touching that, and like really jittery on camera. But playing in person, I find it a little bit easier to just kind of like leave my hand on the table and kind of just like stare off into space.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, still paying attention to the game, but yeah, it's interesting.
That's a really interesting point because you would think over webcam you wouldn't be nervous or anything like that, but like especially in tournament settings, which is normally when you're playing on webcam with random people, you get kind of jittery. Like you're in that
Mhm.
fourth game and it's all coming down on this, and they can't see me. All they can see is literally my hand on the table, like in the
Mm-hmm.
camera view. But it's still like makes you build up. But when I'm playing in person, it's always with friends and stuff, so I'm like calmer. I mean, they call my bluff like almost all the time. I don't know if it's in my face or whatever, but it's a lot like smoother. But I don't know if it's just because I haven't played IRL tournaments yet.
Yeah,
But
Yeah.
either way, it's definitely a different experience.
But it
Definitely.
is a skill that you have to learn over time. There's no on-off switch for just being like really good at politics. There's no like one thing we can say to just make you like a master manipulator.
Yeah.
It'll take a couple years.
Play
Oh,
play a
definitely.
lot of games with Greg, and you'll get better at politicking for sure.
Just
So
a
that's how
little
I'm
bit.
doing it.
My favorite experience in recent memory was playing in person with playing a power crew, and I don't remember the exact context of it, but Zach cast some spell, or like he revealed that he was going to cast a spell, and then before he declared targets, we had this conversation for like 4 minutes, and eventually he was like, "Fine, I hate this, but I guess I'm targeting whatever Greg wants," and it was a really good feeling because it ended up I didn't win that game, but like I was way ahead of the other opponents, so
Yeah,
it still
Thoracle
felt good.
ETB on the stack will probably do that to you.
Yeah.
So when I was first learning Magic, which wasn't that long ago, I was told the phrase it's Magic is easy to learn but impossible to master, and I didn't really understand that until I learned that there was a thing called the stack, um, that things had to resolve in an order and everything used it. And I was like, what the fuck is that? But as soon as I learned what it was and you're able to actually understand how it works, interacting with your opponents becomes infinitely easier. Because if you can just visualize how the stack looks and how letting certain things resolve before you regain priority and knowing when you regain priority to interact is so important. Like if there's a wheel on the stack but someone casts an oppo in response, to get it out of their hand, you can let the opposition agent resolve and then do things like besage you someone's enchantment or land so they don't get to tutor. And it's like all these like little things, even if they're not winning the game, really add up just by learning and knowing what the stack is. Um, and that's just the main argument I think that you can make about learning when to interact with your opponents outside of just when they're winning the game.
Right. And it also it like kind of comes down to like knowing what your opponents are playing too, knowing how their decks work, and which is really hard because there's so many different CDH decks, and people are playing a lot of different stuff. It's kind of hard to know what someone is doing. Like the first time I played against a Magda player, I was like, how the hell or when do I even
Oh,
interact with this?
yeah.
Because they can kind of just play over top. Same thing with Gitrog. Like first time I played against Noah on his Gitrog, I was trying to go for a win, and he just wins over top of me. So it's kind of like you kind of have to know, and this just comes from years of experience of just knowing those decks. But yeah, not sure what point I'm making here.
No, it 100% makes sense. There's every single deck I've played against that I don't know. Like I've never played against this deck before. I look at the commander, I try to get some idea in my mind of what they're going to try to do. Like this random planeswalker that just mills 4 cards into the graveyard, but sans blue, probably turbo breach. But all these things that we're talking about is just knowledge of the format, which is why the stack and interacting is so complicated.
Right.
Um, so it's I don't even know how you're supposed to begin talking about that, right?
I
So,
I think I,
so what's the best way to learn about the stack? Like, if someone is like, they play Commander kind of casually, they want to get into CDH, they've been watching CDH content, but they're like, how do I like really deep dive in on the stack? What deck would you recommend they play?
Ooh, deck I recommend they play.
That makes the
Definitely.
stack really complicated.
Oh,
Because
the
I can think of
hardest.
two decks on the top of my head. So.
Let's see if we're thinking about the same one. I'm thinking of Narset Enlightened Master. I think that's the deck that I've seen the most spells on the stack at the same time ever,
Okay,
or it triggers
that's
at
a good one.
least. Um,
Gitrog
what
is up
decks are
there
you thinking?
honestly.
Okay,
So
Rog.
my two are actually going to be the Gitrog Monster and Elsha the Infinite.
Oh, that's the one
Or
that's the one I meant. Fuck. I am
yeah, instead I said
like I said, I don't play against these decks. I was thinking of this.
yeah,
I was thinking of that one, right? Elsha the Infinite.
yeah,
It's the one you can cast the spell at instant speed off the
Yep.
top of your library.
yeah,
That's the
The
one I
one
was
Zach
thinking
yeah,
has
of.
recently gotten back into.
Yeah,
yeah.
I've
It's
played
a really
against
scary
that
deck.
deck. It
Elsha is
really
kind of
It is.
insane, but I think those are both fantastic decks to pick up if you really want to learn how to play the stack
Yeah.
properly.
Oh, those are
Um,
such hard decks to pilot.
they're very difficult decks to pilot, but I think if you can master those decks, like you'll win a lot of games. You'll have a great time with them. But I mean, and those decks are only difficult because like a lot of stuff can happen at instant speed with Elsha, right? Where it's like, you're looking at the top card of your library and maybe a counterspell. Maybe you recently brainstormed, so you have a counterspell and then like an artifact or something off the top, or like a soul ring or whatever, right? It puts you in this like really cool position where you can cast your counterspell and then like cast another thing in response to it because it's now left and the top card has changed. You can do wacky things with that list. And then with Gitrog Monster, once you actually start comboing, there's just so many triggers that hit the stack in terms of dredging and in terms of the Gitrog trigger itself, where something goes to the yard and you draw a card. And if you're doing like an end step discard, um, I don't remember the exact Gitrog term, but you basically get to stack your deck and hand using the Shuffle Titan loop. That's really complicated because you keep on resetting the cleanup step, but if you can master those, like you'll really start to get better at CDH, specifically with being able to manage the stack and play the stack properly.
Yeah.
I
I
think
think one thing that also helps too with stack management is actually like having tokens set aside to establish, what
Mhm.
is on the stack. I think that's really important as a little tip or tool set to help learn.
visualizing the stack.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
that can
Because
be really
I've
useful with a
forgotten
Niv Mizzet.
I've forgotten triggers before that have lost me tournaments. Still bummed about that one.
Yeah. Now, visualizing can really help with something like a Niv Mizzet, right? Where it's like every time an opponent casts a spell, an instant or sorcery, a Niv Mizzet trigger goes on the stack, and then another round of priority happens, and then when that priority is done, you draw a card, and then it creates a second, so that creates another Niv Mizzet trigger where you get to point a damage at something. It's just, it makes everything way more miserable to resolve because
Let's
people will start responding to the draw triggers.
How about this? This is a little tangent side thing. What is the most complicated stack interaction you've ever encountered, Greg?
Oh God.
Because I can think of one off the top of my head, but I'm curious of what you think.
So it was a game that I played with Zach from Playing with Power, and I had an Isochron Scepter dramatic reversal going, a ton of interaction in hand, but Zach had a Remora out. And so every time I attempted a loop, he would draw a card and I would, do my thing. But I couldn't create infinite mana and pay for his Remora. And so I was doing this weird Thrasios thing where I was keeping track of all of the mana being generated, and we went through like 17 loops manually with all the triggers and playing priority properly. That was a crazy game. I think I won that game. I don't remember, honestly. It was a while ago, but I just remember the Isochron Scepter turn took like an hour, where we were just sitting there as like activate, pass priority, draw cards, do all this weird shit. Yeah, it was a mess. But
Oh, definitely. Yeah, my personal, I guess it's just the interaction that is always the most complicated is when two consecrated sphinxes are out.
oh no.
Right? So you draw two, or you draw a card, and then they draw two for each card drawn. So then they would draw two in one resolution, but then two of your Sphinx triggers go on the stack because it's one for each card drawn. So just keeping track, because even if it's not like they're drawing their decks and they just like are stopping at a certain point, trying to visually or just keep track of how many triggers of whose are on the stack is just absolutely horrendously ridiculous.
I think if it wasn't in a tournament setting, I would just tell my opponent to pick up 80 cards, continue on with their lives. But
Yeah, it's only happened a few times, but that is by far my least favorite stack interaction I've ever come across.
that's just terrible. I don't know.
It's by far the worst. Dante, is there anything that you can think of that you just absolutely hate on the stack?
I had one game where I actually lost because I didn't play it out right, and it was a Sakashima Kodama deck that I was playing, where I have Psychic Pickpocket, which is you play it, it connives, and then you can bounce it back to your hand. So with Kodama and Sakashima out, you can do that and connive your whole deck.
Oh yeah.
And it's basically like it was like my version of just conniving my deck away and then playing like a lad man or a Thassa's Oracle and winning that way. But when someone casts a brain freeze on you, then you have to really pay attention to what you're conniving away.
Mhm.
So it was, anyways, yeah. I connived
Yeah, that's definitely
too many
rough.
times and then lost to a brain freeze. So
Oh, that's
Yeah,
brutal.
it's definitely rough.
yeah.
I think it'd be really cool if we talked through some of the I don't want to say tips and tricks of the stack, but things that you can do to help the stack work for you instead of against you,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. Like responding to certain things on the stack or when to let things resolve before you resolve other things.
If you're ever trying to do something at instant speed, wait until someone cracks a fetch land. Because usually what happens is someone will crack a fetch, and then opposition agent won't get cast, and someone else will crack their fetch. And then with both fetches on the stack, cast your Naws. Cast whatever you're going to do at instant speed, be it like a Limb Duel's Vault, whatever you're going to try to do. Because, people just strip mine themselves, and they're not going to have mana until the whole stack resolves.
I gotta write
And
that down.
it's
Oh,
a really
100%.
good tip.
That's really
It's a
good.
really good tip. A lot of people just like, if there's a counterspell war going on, right? I, X is happening or whatever, and then someone cracks their fetch land in the middle of the stack, right? Just start interacting on top of the fetch land crack, right? Because they're not going to have mana to cast whatever they're trying to cast in their hand.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, you get
it's
burned
a
by that a couple
dirty
times.
trick, but it's really, really hot. It's a nice trick.
Yeah, you get burned by that too many times, and you're definitely looking out for it for the rest of the games you'll ever play.
Yeah.
It's really just like learning how to be like more mean and more cruel to your opponents and to their
Yeah.
resources.
Yeah, if you want to get really good at like um if you want to get really good at utilizing the stack or um I don't want to say abusing the stack
Well,
because that's
it's like I said, you want to make the stack
silly term.
work for you instead of against you.
Yeah.
So when you make the stack work for you, it makes you kind of feel dirty for doing it, but you're not. You're just reacting at the opportune time to limit your chance of your opponents doing something in between or optimizing the amount of mana you have between spell casts and things like that,
Yeah.
just by
Hmm.
paying attention to what is happening.
I mean, you're just playing the game.
Yeah,
Yeah,
playing most
makes a lot of
optimally.
sense. Yeah. No, and the other thing is specifically with Limb Duel's Vault, and if you have like a Rhystic Study or a Remora out, I've had one time that I can remember where there was a huge counterspell war, and people kept on responding to my Remora triggers, and then eventually it got to the point where it was like a Mindbreak Trap went on the stack, it exiled everything. I had four Remora triggers. I cast a Limb Duel's Vault on top of all of it, got to assemble my pile, and then drew 4 of the 5 cards of a Limduel's pile at instant speed, which was awesome, but doesn't happen often. But like, just keep track of like what you have on the stack because those triggers are going to happen at some point because the stack has to resolve for the game to continue.
Yeah.
Right. So once something hits the stack, you have to remember that that resource isn't gone from you. It's going to be there just at a later time.
100%. I think the most common thing is just responding to Mystic Remora triggers and Rhystic Study triggers when a counterspell war, because you don't
Mm,
want your opponent to draw the card that they could draw before you go to counter whatever you're trying to counter, because then they
mm-hmm.
could have just top decked that counterspell to stop you.
Yeah.
That's where the most triggers I think go on the stack in any stack interaction, at
Mm-hmm.
least when it's like manual stack interaction.
Yeah, especially when you also have like 2 or 3 players have draw effects, be like an Esper Sentinel, a Crom, a Rhystic Study, or a Mystic Remora. A lot of triggers can go on the stack at once, and a lot of people will respond to those triggers to prevent people from gaining their advantage back.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Not being hasty with what you're doing. Have you ever tried to like cast a tutor or something just because you're just trying to get it over with and get it out of your
Oh,
hand and
I
whatever?
hate casting Imperial Seal on like turn 1 because I've gotten burned so many times by
Right.
someone just like, oop, here's a land spirit guide hasty Ragavan coming at you. And it's
Oh yeah, you're gonna grab their mana crypt, whatever great spell
it's
that they
usually a
grabbed.
Remora. It's so brutal.
Oh, it's definitely rough. But when I was like, I always bring up like being like just getting into it, but that's like where all the learning happens. When people would just cast their Vampiric Tutor or Mystical Tutor or something in their main phase,
Mm-hmm.
just to get it over with, but then they end up getting burned by that Ragavan or a mill, like they've someone cast something that mills them or something,
Mm-hmm.
and then they lose that resource. But if they would have just not been so hasty with it, they would have been just fine, right?
Yeah.
I can definitely think of a couple times where it's just happened to me, and I just cast this Worldly Tutor or whatever, but then I get it stolen from me or milled or whatever, and I just lose all that resource just because I was being too hasty. And this kind of it's really really stupid mistake, but it leads really hard into everything else you ever do in Magic. You don't want to be
Mm-hmm.
hasty with anything. You want to always get as much information out of your opponents as possible before you take a game action.
Yeah.
Um, Tutors and everything, it all involves just trying to get as much information as possible before you take whatever action you're going to take.
100%. And I think there is a tangent here to say, like, is it worth it to run flexible interaction? um I know that I am a big fan of Winds of Rebuke as a spell. It's just 2 CMC, a blue and a colorless instant, return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand or whatever, and then each player mills 2 cards, which is awesome because you'll get so many people who like top deck tutor straight to the bin. Or what's also really funny is if you have a Dothy Voidwalker out, and then it's like, all right, I'm gonna draw 6 cards effectively off of this Winds of Rebuke. It
Yeah,
is really fun.
those flexible interaction pieces and flexible cards is the reason why you want to have so much so much knowledge before you do the game action. Because if
Mhm.
you burn it early and then someone else plays an even bigger threat, then you're lost that resource when you would have rather just dealt with the bigger threat, using your flexible interaction piece, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So like, what do we think about like being? We spoke about this earlier, but like, just be patient with your interaction. Never like volunteer to counter something unless it's like, it's revealed information, but you still shouldn't volunteer it until someone points out that you still have this piece in your hand that you haven't spent. um, I mean, because if you start to volunteer to interact with things in one game, if you play in a league, you play in a regular meta, you're gonna get voluntold to do that in the future. uh, and sometimes you just have to pass priority on things. uh, it's
Yeah.
the only way to prevent yourself from
And
getting
that's really
constantly
just the
priority
big
bullied.
takeaway of everything we're talking about, is that you just need to do the thing when you're supposed to do it, but that's just the skill that you have to learn,
Mm.
right? So you're supposed to like
Hmm.
wait to do pretty much everything, but then you have to respond at the right time so you don't like respond too late type of thing. Um, I think one of my favorite places to interact is in combat before attackers are declared. Um, I'm sure we've all played against Winota, which is just a pain in the
Yeah.
ass, right? But if you remove the Winota in combat, but before attackers are declared, you can bounce or remove the Winota before they have a chance to recast it in their main phase.
Hmm.
Uh, but that's just an example of knowing the stack and just waiting for when you're supposed to do it, so you limit your resources to your
Don't do
opponents.
that against Crixus Malcolm, though, because Glinthorn, I think it just has to be in combat,
Yeah, it just
right?
has to be in
So
combat.
yeah, you
No, but
have to kill that shit in
but
main phase.
the Malcolm needs to be on the battlefield though, in order for it to work.
Yeah, but if you're in combat, right, and you point a removal piece at Malcolm before combat is declared,
Oh no, you're
or
right, because
before
they
attackers
can
are declared,
respond,
yeah, you can just
to it. Yeah,
respond to it,
I'm
and
stupid.
because it's in combat. um, so
Yeah, but that's just
that's
game sense at that point, which is also just a really hard thing to talk about. The
yeah,
topic in
it
general
just
is
comes
just
from
so
experience.
general.
So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So the process of casting spells, just like couple, just like fire off tips and tricks to avoid being priority bullied and how to bully others back. um I think I said this earlier, but please stop pre-tapping your lands when casting spells. When you cast a spell from any zone, you move the spell from that zone to the stack, and then you pay all costs for that spell. So if you have 10 mana open, right? This is actually a situation that comes up often, especially in tournament settings, as I've found. If I have all of this mana open and someone has like a Naz on the stack, right? And you can tell that that player with the Naz is like excited because they have like a protected Naz or something. You can put your force of negation or force of will on the stack, right? And until you pay the cost for that, if your opponents are really jumpy and they immediately show you a counterspell, right? You haven't paid the cost of force of will. And so you've announced that you're casting force of will. You haven't announced a target for it. You haven't actually paid the cost. But once you put the spell on the stack, then you can determine if you're paying 5 mana or you're losing a life and pitching a blue card from your hand. And just knowing how to actually cast a spell can really, especially against jumpy players, especially against stressed out players, they will just throw their interaction down or immediately pick up their hand or start tapping lands to respond before you've actually cast the spell. And it's a really filthy trick, but it works to see if people have cards in hand.
Yeah, I mean, you've got me so many times, so.
Yeah, it's fun. But there's other things like you shouldn't answer it from a control perspective, right? Because that's all I play. But you shouldn't answer anything that isn't either like a complete game lockout or like game ending, right? So like you should probably counter a Trinisphere unless you like are sitting on a Beseiju in hand. Um, but like if someone plays a Rule of Law or someone plays like a Static Orb or something, like if you can confidently play around it or at least play around it better than the other two opponents that aren't running that effect, you should probably leave it in play because you just want the game to go long.
Yeah, and in this case, you're not really sandbagging your interaction, but you're just still waiting for the correct moment to interact, which is really what you're always trying to do, at least in a control list, is iPads. Sandbagging is just like the biggest idea, right? You're just waiting until there's something that you absolutely have to deal with on the stack. So talking about just when a player gets priority is really important, and knowing when you as a player get priority is kind of just gives you an idea of when to interact with what you have and when it's too late to interact. So we'll just give a quick run through of what it's like and when you get priority during a turn and all the kind of weird interactions. So first there's the untap. Untap, no player will get priority unless there's a trigger on untap. Like Mesmeric Orb is one I can think of off the top of my head, right? When a player untaps a permanent, then they mill a card, that will trigger in the untap phase, and then priority will be passed on those triggers before they happen. But if there's no other triggers or no triggers happen at all, it just moves right to upkeep. Upkeep is where all players will regain priority before the draw step. No sorceries can be cast here, so people are looking to interact with you before you either get another card into your hand or you're able to cast anything that is sorcery speed, like a creature or appear into the abyss or something like that.
So this is
Uh,
the opportune time to cast a silence.
yeah,
If
silence is probably the most cast spell in the upkeep.
yeah,
But right after a top deck tutor probably, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you can untap your resources, cast your top deck tutor, and then draw the card you just tutored for, right? All in
Yeah.
one free main phase progression. And then after you draw a card, priority is then passed again around the table, which no one really interacts here because if they wanted to interact, they'd probably want to interact before you drew a card and saw more resources. So you
Mm-hmm.
kind of don't want to interact after they have more resources if you had the opportunity not to. And then you'll get into the main phase, and main phase is it's just kind of like the upkeep, except you get priority and you can cast sorcery spells and creatures. Anything at sorcery speed. And then, so that's really simple, right? That's where all the main big cool things happen. Combat is where it gets really complicated, and I didn't actually learn combat phases until I played against a lot of Yuriko, because I was like, wait, you can't do that. Then you look at the core rules, and it turns out they can do that. So priority in combat happens all in like a sub phase. So there's combat, right? So they announce they're entering combat. Everyone passes priority on the switching of phases. And then in combat, there's a priority pass before attackers are declared. And then there's priority passed again after attackers are declared. And then blockers are declared. And then priority is passed again on blockers. And then damage is assigned. And then after damage, there's another round of priority where the players will be able to just do whatever they want after the damage happens. This is right after. So if you have a combat trick, right, you're going to do it right after the blockers are declared. So you can let them do whatever they're going to do and then do the combat trick, so they can't really respond to it. But after this phase is where Yuriko, I know, really shines. I haven't really seen another deck utilize this part of the combat step. But after damage and that priority, all the creatures are still attacking. So ninjutsu can happen there, and I don't think of anything else. Can you think of anything else that happens in this phase, like after damage is done?
Oh gosh, this is the phase where Najila likes to do stuff, right? Because it's still in combat. You haven't gone to second main. And this is where you activate Najila to untap everything and get a second combat step.
Yeah, things like that. It's just like combat tricks all can happen right at this moment because everything in all the combat actions have already happened, but you're able to still be in combat and do cool things.
Yeah, this is where you activate Najila. This is where you activate Glinthorn.
Right.
That's all I can
think. That's it.
I mean, it's really that's why it's not so known, is because not really a lot of decks are able to use this part of the priority, but it is important that it is there for things like that.
Yeah.
And then main phase 2 is the same as main phase 1, right? Everyone's going to pass priority if no one has any game actions. Now, end step and cleanup is probably one of the harder things that I had to learn when I was just starting and didn't really understand. So the end step's going to happen. If everyone passes priority in the end step, then no one is going to get priority in the cleanup, right? And then the cleanup is when we'll talk about unless. But normally, like if I have 10 cards in my hand and I have to discard the hand size, if the next player has an end step action on my turn, and so they hold priority and do their action, I don't discard 2 hand size yet until after we're in cleanup.
So this is actually an interesting thing, because when you try to change phases from main 2 or second main to end step, right? It's like you announce that you're going to end step, right? Priority passes to the next player, they have nothing. Priority passes to the next player, they have nothing. Priority passes to the next player, and they're going to put a Thrasios activation on the stack. Their Thrasios activation resolves or whatever, right? They do their thing. This doesn't actually send you immediately to the end step, because whenever you try to change phases on your turn, like going from main to combat, from combat to main 2, from main 2 to end step, you're asking the table permission to do that. And if they have it, it puts you back into main phase. It puts you back into your phase, where you can then attempt to ask permission to do it again. So you can, if you have, 10, 12 cards in hand, and you're like, oh, this other player has a ton of mana open, right? Here's the biggest gamble of my life. Pass the turn, or attempt to pass the turn, move to end step, right? If that player taps out to do their thing, right, you're now back into your second main with all of your cards because you haven't discarded, and they just tapped out like 8 mana to do 2 Thrasios activations, and now you can just do whatever the heck you want. But it is a super huge risk, right? Because if you're just going to go straight to second main and pass the turn with all these cards in hand, right, the other person could just say, yep, great, pass the turn. They miss out on their 2 card draw, but then you're going to discard everything and time walk yourself. But it is really important that you do ask permission to move phases in that situation. So
yeah, and in all situations, you kind of want to ask permission, because if you just start hastily doing what you're going to do, they have more information than what they would have to interact in the first place. So cleanup is really complicated in the way that there's like just random things that trigger, and you have to know what those things are. Things like so it's just like the untap, right? No triggers, no one gets priority unless there's a trigger that happens when something would happen during that phase. So the example with Mesmeric Orb and untap is the same thing with like a discard or enter the graveyard trigger in cleanup when you're discarding into hand size. So that's just kind of the weird interaction that I can think of, where if you discard a Shuffle Titan, then the trigger to shuffle your graveyard into your deck will go on the stack, or things like Necropotence. I know triggers in. I think Necropotence triggers in the cleanup step, right? Yep. So there's just like these weird things, but no one is going to get priority unless there's a trigger that happens from an action that would occur during cleanup.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I know there's a version of Curious Control that I'm not playing, but runs Glinthorn plus curiosity things, and that's how the combo wins without Malcolm. Is at end step you have a Glinthorn Buccaneer plus curiosity and like 11 cards in hand, and when you go to discard, it will start this kind of soft loop of, oh, okay, well now I've discarded cards, trigger Glinthorn. Now that I've discarded, everyone's going to take damage. I'll trigger Curiosity. I'll draw those cards again. And then you have to attempt to discard back to 7 cards. And so it just creates this loop where it's like, all right, great, I'm going to do damage equal to the number of cards left in my deck to everyone. And that's an example of an end step loop. And Gitrog can do a very similar thing. If you've got Gitrog and lands in hand, and more than 7 cards, you need 8 cards, 9 cards in hand. You can discard a land and a creature, or a land in like an instant, right? Trigger Gitrog, draw a card. Now you have to discard back down to 7, and you can just create that loop to dig through your deck really, really fast.
Yeah, priority is so important because, like you said, priority is permission, and it's important to know when you have permission, because if you try to do things and you don't have permission, then you're just giving your opponents information, or you're
and
doing
it's a
something
game
suboptimal.
rules violation.
Game rules violation. Game lost.
So when you interact with a Gitrog player that's in that end step, or that
You
Glinthorn
can't.
player, that's
Well, you'll get priority. But...
You have to wait for priority. And so if they attempt to do the end step loop and you have like a pact negation, right? You just wait until, and if they have no onboard discard, right? You wait for the draw trigger to happen, and then when priority gets passed to you on the draw trigger, that's when you just remove the Gitrog.
Gotcha.
Right. But you can't do it once the draw trigger resolves and it goes back to them discarding, right? There's no point to interact after like the stack is empty and they're just discarding their hand. It's really weird.
This is one of the most defining things of CDH to me is this isn't going to happen in casual with these crazy stack interactions and people trying to do things before other people are trying to do things, and there's all these effects, right? But if you're sitting down at a CDH table, I like the example of Magda, and you just have no fucking clue what's about to happen, and you just try to do something, and then they try to do something. You've lost the chance to respond to anything. Like you can't do anything. But as soon as you learn the stack and learn how things work, you can kind of use priority to your advantage and try to make your opponents do things before you do things and all this other stuff. That's like impossible to talk about in 1 hour long, 50-minute podcast, whatever. So I think it's so complicated just in and of itself to just talk about right here. I will say that when I'm watching a CDH video and just like learning about what other decks do, they do represent the stack really well and whatever's happening. So that's how I kind of learn where and what to interact with, even though I don't play against different decks all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's, one of my favorite parts about like playing with power or play to win, is the actual visualization of the stack. And playing with power has some crazy ass videos where their stack is like 30 plus cards, and it's just like I would hate to edit that video.
I hate to play those games. I think every game I play with Sean or at Spielerwho on Discord, at the end of the game we always joke about how like every time we sit down we should just record the game, because almost every time it's like a 2.5 hour long
crazy stack
cluster. Like everyone is playing these Thrasios mid-range piles and the games are just insane. I think the couple games ago I played with Sean, he ended up winning from a manual Thassa's Oracle just from drawing his deck. Like no consult, no fancy tricks, just drawing his deck from a sheer 3.5 hour long game. Wow. It was insane.
I feel like every time I play against Sean, he just casts silence on me when I'm trying to win, and I can't do anything. His most brutal silence was a Jessica's Will that I cast. It exiled my win cons, and I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna cast these win cons," and then silence. And it's like, well, now I can't cast anything. I'm not gonna win.
Yeah,
it's all gone.
It reminds me of this game I played where 3 players had Rhystic Studies, and my friend Mark was on Blood Pod, and he attempted to resolve 3 separate silences on his turn, and all of them got countered. And then every turn after that one, at least 4 pieces of interaction were used for like the next 3 rotations, and then someone finally won the game.
Wow.
It
How
was
did was it
intense.
just 3 separate silence type cards? So like
Yeah, it was
silence,
3. It
orange
was it
champ.
was Silence, Veil of Summer, Ranger Captain. So I guess
Okay.
it's not technically Silence, but a resolved Veil of Summer it's pretty much a Silence.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of use it as one.
Yeah, it's a very safe way to play. Um, so I think like one of the last points I want to bring up about the cleanup is just this very specific example, just to show how complicated things can get. And so, speaking of silences, imagine that the active player is under a silence, but they have Necropotence in play. And the Necropotence trigger at end step puts them to 8 cards in hand, right? Um, and then during the cleanup, they must discard a card down to 7. And the discard causes a Necro to trigger, so priority happens. And at this point, the silence is gone. Like, you have priority in the end step, or in the cleanup, but now that you've like progressed to this point where normally you're not supposed to get priority on anything, but because there was a trigger, you can now do stuff. But the silence is gone,
Cast
so you can
Final
now cast
Fortune.
your Final Fortune, your crop rotation for your emergent zone, crack that and go off.
Mhm.
Like, you can do so many things now that you have priority in this step. And end of turn effects go away. I know there was someone working on a necromancy protein Hulk shenanigan with this, but it's very like fringe case use.
I
I
mean,
keep
yeah.
yeah, I keep running into end step. In the end step, I keep getting dressed down, right? Because dress down says sacrifice at the beginning of end step. But if you're
Mm-hmm.
already in the end step, you can just, when that player gets priority, they can cast a dress down, so they'll have dress down for the entire next turn.
Oh,
Which
yeah.
it keeps happening to me. But that's another example of just knowing like when priority happens and looking at for
Mm-hmm.
keywords, you're able to just really lock out opponents or restrict resources just by knowing when priority in the stack happens.
And there's 2 different wordings on like the until end step things. There's until your next end step or until end of turn. And if you're already in end step and you somehow get priority and you cast that dress down, right? It won't go away until the next end step, so you get the whole turn. But if you
Mhm.
try to do something that says until end of turn, right? You can be in the end step, you can get priority, you can do your thing that happens until end of turn, right? And then it goes away when the turn transitions. It's really, I don't remember what card I was looking at. I'll put it in the show notes below, or I'll tweet about it tomorrow. But it was just some weird thing for Curious Control. It was like, this would be awesome if it didn't get stopped by this silly line of text.
100%. I
Yeah.
think the last thing that I actually wanted to bring up, just as a whole, is know when to hold priority.
Mm.
Oh my
I think
god.
holding priority is really important on a lot of things. Um, the biggest thing is if I see this all the time that people have like no resources, but they'll have their tutor on a wish claw or something like that, and the LED on the battlefield or whatever it is, and they'll tutor and not hold priority cracking LED even though they have no cards in hand anyway, and just be able to get and play whatever they tutor for.
Yeah.
Um, that's just one example of where you should probably hold priority and reevaluate what you're doing just to give yourself that knowledge of the stack just progresses you so much farther than you would be in the first place. Um, things
Mm-hmm.
like if you get draw triggers on, or you get to look at the top card of your deck is another thing, right? Cast a spell, look at the top, hold priority. Then you could do something else. That's like what Elshev the Infinite tries to do. I'm trying to think of anything else you'd want to hold priority on off the top of my head,
I mean,
but it's
Thassa's
really
Oracle.
important to know when you're allowed to hold priority and
Yeah.
react to even yourself.
Yeah.
Because you're
Mm-hmm.
changing, when you do take a game action, you're actively changing the resources on the board and the game and the action taking place, so you're able to utilize that before your opponents are able to react to you.
Mm-hmm. Actually, Dante just made a great point, but you have to remember to hold priority on Thassa's Oracle for your consultation. I was playing a practice game for a tournament, and the guy, the guy in my pod was like, "We have to play this at like Comp REL because I really need practice for this event." And I was like, "All right, that
Mhm.
makes sense." And then he ended up going for the win on turn 3, cast Thassa's Oracle. We let it resolve, and then he passed priority on the ETB to the point where he said pass priority, and everyone else was just like instantly pass priority. Let this resolve. Don't let it get back to him. And once he passed, and completely fucked up the trigger. But
Okay.
we held him to it because
That
it was
was
Campari else.
the first time I cast Thassa's Oracle, I had no idea that you had to hold priority, so I did the same thing.
Yeah, it happens to everybody at least once, and then they'll just never do it again.
Yeah,
so.
they'll learn from that.
Oh yeah.
100%.
And so, as we bring this show to a wrap, I like to get a community question from the internet, specifically Twitter. And a lot of the questions that people were commenting on my post were not very appropriate. So, we're going to go with this lovely one from Zach, our actual fourth co-host, or third co-host, fourth member of the crew. And he asks, what is the card you dread facing the most in CDH?
Ooh, card or commander?
Just card. So it's Blood Moon. I hate that card.
Yeah.
Can't stand a Blood Moon.
Why do you hate playing against Blood Moon?
Because I play 4 colors. It's miserable. I swear, if they ban Dockside and people start playing Blood Moon again, I might sell out a CDH.
Yeah. I think Draenith Magistrate's pretty up there, but I know I can play around a Draenith pretty well. Blood Moon is really, really hard to play against. I don't know.
Or just
Torpor
probably the answer is like
unfun.
any random white stacks piece that Charles is playing.
Yeah,
But...
pretty much.
I think me personally as a player, I absolutely despise Torpor Orb. That card, the decks that are playing it are the cards that aren't be able to run the best cards in the format, so it's already kind of down there. But then they bring this thing out, and we all have to just kind of sit around a Torpor Orb until it leaves, and it just doesn't do anything else for the game. It's like the issue I have with it is it's not always a symmetrical stacks piece. So someone will put this out there, and maybe it stops one deck from Thoracling. One person's got the Dockside in their hand, but the third person is just completely unfazed and just moves forward with whatever the hell they're doing, while no other player is able to progress or attempt anything.
Because they're going for like an Isochron Scepter line or some Swift reconfiguration thing, and it's like they don't care about the...
Or it's Winota, it's whatever it is.
I feel like the guy that's playing Torpor Orb also has a Collector Oof out, or like a Noron, so...
Most of the time they do. But...
And that's fine, it's a Torpor Orb. Jeez.
Oh gosh, Tabernacle's a card. Oh my god.
Actually,
I've never had to play against that, so I hope that day never comes.
I did a spicy play, and it's actually on the Playing with Power, one of the Playing with Power videos, where Cal plays a Tabernacle, and in my upkeep I Immersion Zone and do a whole bunch of stack interaction on top of that Tabernacle trigger, just so I don't have to pay for it. And I win, and that's great. I love it.
Nice.
Oh, that's
one of my favorite plays.
All right, and I think with that, we'll start the actual wrapping up process. You can find me on Twitter at Curious Control. Where can they find the rest of you guys?
You can find me at Evan Zyvel on Twitter or Zclan7 on Discord. Dante, what about you?
Yeah, Dante MTG on Discord, and then Dante, or on Twitter, I'm at Kodama Nuts. Kodama's my favorite commander, so there you go.
Yeah, Kodama Nuts. Got him.
Yeah. And this is the point where we're gonna pass priority, or it's like to say, we'll cue outro music, and see you guys next week. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
You have a response?
I hope for
Flashing this Notion Thief.
Solitude, your Niv Mizzet.
No, that's traumatizing. All right. But anyways, thank you guys for listening. We'll pass priority. Peace.
Pass priority.